Welcome back to the third episode of this series, where I'm going to talk with Jonathan Howard, MD, a real doctor who has written a book about anti-vaccine and the movement around it. How did you come across the idea? Oh, first of all, you're an actual MD, the first sort of medical person that I've got. So what is your background in science that promotes you to do this kind of thing?
Yeah, so I'm not a scientist, I'm a doctor, and I do think there's an important distinction to be made there. I look smart and capable only because scientists allow me to use medications and treatments and tests that they've developed. But I've had a very long interest in conspiracy theories, particularly with regards to the anti-vaccine movement. When a doctor who I trained with became one of America's most outspoken anti-vaccine doctors. This was a woman by the name of Dr. Kelly Brogan, and I'm both a psychiatrist and a neurologist, and she's a psychiatrist. She's kind of retired from the practice of medicine, and I knew her. We'd last spoken about 2010, so it's been a long time. And we were friends. We had a nice relationship. It doesn't matter. But shortly after she left NYU, where I work, she started posting all this anti-vaccine content on Facebook. And I was only vaguely aware of the anti-vaccine movement until then. But I became fascinated by this. And I couldn't refute a lot of the things that she was posting initially. I didn't know how to respond to them. And over the past decade or 13 years or so, I have just immersed myself, mostly out of curiosity, in the world of in the world of anti-vaccine myths and how to respond to them, how to refute them.
Or how did you start debunking them then?
So the first thing that I had to do was learn the facts and learn the truth. And so you have to know the basics about vaccines. I'm not saying exactly which one is a live attenuated vaccine, this sort of thing, but what is the truth about what vaccine preventable diseases used to do to children before vaccines came around? What are the tricks that anti-vaxxers use to minimize the viruses? And what's the truth about how effective and how safe vaccines are, and what myths do anti-vaxxers spread about that? So I first started doing this kind of anonymously, helping to create infographics for a pro-vaccine Facebook page. And that actually was very helpful because it forced you to condense a lot of data into very simple ideas and very simple graphics to refute anti-vaccine ideas. And I made hundreds, if not thousands, of infographics to help people learn about vaccines. Then in 2018, I wrote a book chapter in a book called Pseudoscience. I co-authored this with law professor Dorit Reese, just about all the flaws and fallacies in anti-vaccine ideas. And that really prepared me, unfortunately, for the pandemic. And I've always been fascinated by people like Dr. Kelly Brogan, i.e., anti-vaccine doctors, right? What makes a doctor turn against vaccines? Because she's very smart. She went to MIT, she went to Cornell, she trained with me here at NYU, New York University, so she knows her stuff. She's not stupid. But what flipped in her mind to reject really medicine's greatest achievement? There's nothing else that I can think of where you give 2 or 3 shots and you're protected from polio, measles, diphtheria, HPV, whooping cough, etc. I'm not really sure that I have an answer to that, but I was always fascinated and very upset by anti-vaccine doctors because they come to this with credibility. So to me, I liken them to arsonist firefighters. And it was really disturbing to see how many doctors started spewing anti-vaccine myths during the pandemic. They probably didn't even know that they were doing this, but they were.
So what is it that you're hoping to achieve then?
So I'm hoping to achieve putting out accurate information in the world and really not letting doctors get away with spreading anti-vaccine misinformation. So I think there's our profession, like most professions, we tend to rally around our own and protect our own. Policemen are not very good at policing policemen. The priests are not very good at policing priests, and no profession is very good at self-regulating itself, it seems. And I'm bothered by the fact that doctors can spread wild myths. So I'll be happy to give you some examples of some of those without any pushback from our colleagues. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like I am the lone one crusader who is doing this. There's a lot of us doing this, but it really should be more of us, and it really should be leaders in medicine saying, no, it is unacceptable for doctors to put out fake numbers, fake statistics about viruses and vaccines.
What about work then? What is a work view of doing this kind of thing?
So my daytime work is as I said, neurology and psychiatry. So I work on the neurology wards at Bellevue Hospital, and I have a multiple sclerosis clinic. So they're really kind of separate, to be totally honest with you. And I think most of my colleagues kind of view this as an odd hobby of mine. Like if I told you I was very into stamp collecting, for example. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm not getting enough credit for what I do. That's not the point I'm trying to get across. I just wish more doctors wouldn't do when they come across members of their own profession spreading anti-vaccine misinformation. And I'm in particular speaking about chairmen of medical departments. I mean, people with power, and they don't have to fire anyone. They don't have to silence anyone. I just wish that they would speak out more about some of the misinformation spread by members of their own department.
Well, certainly in your profession, science is different. It has different problems, but there seems to be an issue on the regulation side. The UK Medical Council have fundamentally failed to act against any of the doctors that were doing misinformation on their side.
Well, unfortunately, the UK, their whole regulatory agencies were, I think, spread a decent amount of misinformation. Early in the pandemic, the JCVI, I forget exactly what that stands for, but the Joint Commission on Vaccines, something like that, their regulatory agency, said that natural COVID infection could have benefits for children and could have benefits for the UK as a whole. So they thought that by infecting children with COVID, they would gain permanent immunity, and the virus would go away and herd immunity would arrive. So I think the UK, they don't have just a few bad actors. I think some of those bad actors really influence policy there. And the result was headlines in the New York Times a few weeks afterwards saying, children drive Britain's longest COVID wave. That appeared in the New York Times in October 2021. So infecting children with COVID, unvaccinated children especially, did not have benefits for the UK.
Talking about anonymity, because you mentioned it, that you said you were initially anonymous. I noticed that a fair few of the people that I talked to are anonymous. Other ones use their real name. How do you feel about that? Because some people like to protect themselves. They feel that they may be attacked, and others feel that using a real qualification, like an MD, for example, lends a bit of credibility.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. That not being anonymous lets people know that they're talking to someone who worked on COVID units and has been studying the anti-vaccine movement for a while. It also takes a little bit of courage to put stuff out under your own name and to not hide behind being anonymous. But I have no problem with people being anonymous just because I do not get it nearly as bad as some people more famous than myself, but get a lot of hate and get a lot of misinformation told about me. I mean, there's a lot of accounts out there saying I never worked on a COVID unit, for example. That's kind of mildly annoying. It's pretty low-hanging fruit. But some more famous people in this country, it's tragic, have needed bodyguards, have had real threats against them, routinely get vile hate and threats. So I don't blame anyone at all for wanting to be anonymous. The main reason that I was anonymous initially was just because that was the nature of the Facebook page, that we would post our infographics, but we wouldn't really put credit to it. So that was just, it wasn't I was really trying to protect myself at the time, but that was just the nature of the page that I was involved with at the time.
What kind of person are you trying to reach with your activism?
Um, I suppose a pretty narrow audience. I don't think that there's a huge mass market for people who are interested in medical misinformation. And most of my writing is very geared toward the United States. I think that's probably pretty typical. Most people focus on their own country, especially us here in America, where we kind of have a very narrow worldview. But my writing and the book that I wrote on this topic, I think what it really hopes to answer the question is before the pandemic, the United States was ranked number one out of 195 countries in pandemic preparedness. And yet we ended up having one of the worst responses. So, what happened? What went wrong here? Anyone who's curious to that question, I hope my writing is some value to them. And I hope that it serves as sort of a wake up call for maybe we'll see who reads it. I don't really know if it's going to be have that broad an audience, but just a younger generation of doctors to know that it's important to speak out against medical misinformation. I think for older generations of doctors, they thought, "Oh, I'm too above that. I'm not going to speak about that sort of stuff." But we live in a new era where social media can disseminate a lie. Or the truth as it was getting on its shoes, as the old saying goes. So I think we doctors have to police our own, and that's who I hope to inspire.
Or you touched on differences between countries. Do you think that some countries do better than others against misinformation?
A good question. I don't really know the exact answer to that just because I don't know exactly what every different sort of country's policies is or how bad things are in certain countries. But it's a worldwide problem. There's no question about it. Some countries have stricter laws against that. I do not come out in favor of legal remedies to spreading misinformation just because I'm wary that someone like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis could one day become president and put a quack in charge of any theoretical misinformation board. So whenever I think about giving the government some power, I'm always very careful to think how would someone who I hate use that power. Um, so again I don't know exactly how big the problem is, other than to say that it's a worldwide problem, and it does seem, at least amongst the English-speaking countries, to be very coordinated. There are a lot of groups that are working together.
Where do I want to go? Oh, yes. So onto politics a little bit, because there seems to be maybe a distribution between the left and the right of politics. I know it's slightly different in the US. You have a slightly different definition of right and left, and a slightly different history of how misinformation comes about. But what is your take on it?
So I think it's very interesting the history of anti-vaccine information here in the United States and around the world because it's a problem. I was about to say as old as vaccines themselves, but it's even older than vaccines themselves because there's a man by the name of Benjamin Jesse who was an English farmer who vaccinated his children before Edward Jenner did, and he was reviled in his community. They thought his children were going to turn into cows and this sort of thing. So anti-vaccine misinformation has always been here. If you'd asked me this question about 10 years ago, I would have said, oh, it's more on the left, it's more on the Hollywood liberals, the hippy-dippy, back-to-nature type. But certainly now, it is much more on the right. And what's interesting is they kind of have two reasons. Number one is this idea of freedom, and they seem to define freedom as doing the opposite of whatever they're told to do. So if vaccines were banned here in the United States, they would be demanding them as a suppressed miracle cure. So for them, freedom is I'll do the exact opposite of what I'm supposed to. That's number one. And number two, I think the thing that links maybe the left and right is this idea of body purity. So I think that a lot of people feel that viruses are natural, which they are, and therefore they are harmless, which they are not. And putting a vaccine into your body in some way makes you impure. And people are very scared of that. And that idea has gained traction on both the right and the left. But here in the United States, the anti-vaccine movement is much more concentrated here on the right now. The only time I've ever heard President Trump's fans or supporters boo him is when he said something positive about the vaccine. And there have been some recent studies here in the United States that more Republicans died after vaccines were available than Democrats. So it's a problem across the country, but definitely more here on the right.
How do you choose when you want to do a little bit of debunking, which things to intervene in and which things to let past?
That's a great question, because I think the biggest risk that a debunker could, the biggest risk that we face is amplifying information that would otherwise die down. So we have to be very wary of that. In my career as a debunker, I have done that. I have sought to debunk some myth that no one would have noticed. But by amplifying it, I gave it more power and more legs. So rule number one, I think, is don't amplify anything that would just fade away. Number two, I try never to punch down. So I will never, I hope, be very strident against someone who's been confused and who's been really genuinely misinformed about vaccines. I really try to go after the big names and the powerful people, although sometimes those lines can be a little bit blurred. And this is why I've had my focus for the most part on doctors who I think spread misinformation. So that's who I really focus on. So if there's some poor soul out there who's been misled by an anti-vaccine misinformation doctor, I try to approach that person with sympathy. But for the anti-vaccine misinformation doctor themselves, I no sympathy from me.
There is a question about whether misinformation specialists are doing it deliberately or whether they are just misinformed themselves.
Yeah, so that's an unanswerable question, I think, because you have to get in someone's mind. And I have listened to debunkers debate this question endlessly, and it never gets answered. And in some ways, it's a little bit irrelevant. And again, I try not to just say, oh, you're a bad person. I try to say, no, here's why you're wrong. Here's why you're saying misinformation. I think that these people do have, at some level, have to appreciate that what they are saying is false, at least some of these things. I'll give you an example. So during the first year and a half of the pandemic here in the United States, one child died of the flu and 1,000 children died of COVID. But there were many doctors who said the flu was more dangerous for children, or the flu killed more children than COVID. So what I'm talking about isn't, I think, subtle stuff. Reasonable people can disagree. Should a 14-year-old who's had 4 vaccines and 2 natural infections, should they get a booster shot right now? I mean, that's a gray area, and reasonable people can disagree about that. But when a doctor says that a virus that killed 1 person is more dangerous than a virus that killed 1,000 people, they have to know at some level that what they're saying isn't true.
Because they should have the information. That goes back to the first thing of medical doctors aren't scientists, but one of your jobs as medical doctors, in case anybody doesn't know, is to keep yourself current on medical advances. That's one of the requirements.
Yeah, no, and these are just basic facts. And it's not even very good logic. It doesn't really matter if the flu is more dangerous than COVID. We can vaccinate children against both. Not that the vaccine is a perfect panacea for either of those 2 viruses, but it's much safer than the virus. So I think doctors use bad logic and fake stats in order to encourage the mass infection of unvaccinated children in the hopes that spreading the virus would get rid of the virus.
I think there's a specific thing that I haven't asked anybody else, but it's kind of specific to the US, or it was slightly worse in the US. There was a lot of political overstatement. So whenever I argue with anti-vaxxers that are from the US, they say, oh, but Fauci said the vaccine was 100% safe or something. So there seemed to be a lot of political over claiming on that side that is now being used as okay, they lie, so it must be wrong.
Yeah, so a few things about that. I mean, Anthony Fauci was on TV a bazillion times and gave a bazillion statements, and some of them aged poorly, and he should be held to account for those. I'm not saying that he should be exempt. I hold myself to those standards. So in my book and on social media, I featured stupid things that I said. The good news about the stupid things that I said is that they were only seen by a very small number of people. But I got some things very wrong, and I don't hide that. I hope. And also, I think another big difference I hope is that I learned from my mistakes. I didn't keep repeating them, etc. But what's funny is that most of the doctors who I write about I think did this. They overpromised vaccines in 2021, saying that they were 100% effective, saying that they were absolutely going to stop transmission and that they were going to end the pandemic. And now in 2023, these same, or even 2022, a year later, these same doctors are saying that was horrible misinformation to say that the vaccines halted transmission. So they are, but they don't apply that to themselves. So we'll only take a quote from Fauci, for example. So I think that a lot of these people have very selective memories about what they said, and they blame other people for the words that came out of their own mouths.
The other things, so just a couple of small things. Money. So it doesn't look like you're making a lot of money from debunking.
Yeah, so right. So I wrote a book, a non-best-selling book. I've written several non-bestsellers, and any advice I have for young doctors looking to get rich, it is to not write a dense medical pro-vaccine textbook about a pandemic that everyone wants to forget. Anti-vaccine books sell a lot more than pro-vaccine books. You can just go look at the bestsellers on Amazon and see that for yourself. I have made some money from my book. It has sold much better than I expected. And most of that money I reinvested in a voice actor to do the audio version of my book. So I have made some money from my writing, but I could have easily made more money just by picking up a few extra weekend shifts at the hospital. But money is a motivating factor, and I think that it has to be taken into account. A lot of doctors have made a lot of money on Substack subscriptions, on their YouTube channel. It can be very easy to get rich spouting anti-vaccine misinformation. There's no question about it.
Which was another where I was about to go to see what you thought was the best way to make money from the anti-vaccine side, whether it's to sell supplements, as some of them are known to do, or to have a good YouTube channel, or to write a book.
You'd have to ask them because I don't do any of that stuff, but I do know that, boy, if I became anti-vaccine, I would be like one of the most sought after anti-vaccine speakers. This doctor who used to promote vaccines finally saw the light. So I probably could get rich and famous spouting anti-vaccine misinformation. I also have to be very charismatic and telegenic. I'm still working on that, but there you go.
I'm interested in how you think the future will go, what the future will hold with both anti-vaccine and pro-vaccine people, seeing as you're focused on that.
At least for the United States, I'm very pessimistic. I think that we're going to see, we're already seeing drops in vaccination rates. And whenever you have that, as soon as clear as night follows day, you're going to have outbreaks. Measles and whooping cough will find these children. So I'm very pessimistic. It's horrible that vaccines seem to become a marker of political identity so that you know if someone is going to take their booster here in the United States, you know that they're a Democrat. I mean, there are exceptions to this, but and if someone is against boosters, they're probably a Republican. So I'm very pessimistic about the future, and I hope that I'm wrong about that. Many of my predictions have aged poorly. This one, I hope, definitely does.
It seems to be very difficult to tell because a few characters are very loud, and that makes you possibly feel that there are more than there really are. But it seems to be very difficult to tell.
Yeah, no, I think there's a very small number of anti-vaccine doctors, but they have gained prominence over the course of the pandemic. So in 2019, for example, a doctor who said the vast majority of children with measles will be just fine, which is true. You don't need to vaccinate your kids against it, which is false. That person would never be meeting with the president, meeting with the governors of state. Actually, I take that back a little bit. Donald Trump did meet with Andrew Wakefield, so scratch that comment. But you get my point. But they never would be in the mainstream media. They would be laughed out of our top institutions. Now they are platformed by the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Magazine, Fox News, and they get promotions. So I think it's very unfortunate that that happens.
What do you feel that social media has played, or what role do you feel that social media has played in all of this?
I think it's so social media is definitely Pandora's box. It's and Twitter, for example, has allowed me and everyone else to see studies that I never would have seen before, and to hear voices that I never would have been exposed to before, which is good. But it's also allowed people to spread misinformation unchecked, and people can seem very, very credible when in fact they have no idea what they're talking.